Hello everyone. In this next couple of videos, I'm going to be talking specifically about feminist ethics and what's known as the ethics of care. And these are different ways of characterizing ethics as opposed to more traditional ethical theories like utilitarianism and deontology. But before we get into that, I just need to make a couple of remarks about feminism in general. Now, obviously, feminism philosophically and in social criticism and in sociology, a lot has been written about feminist topics. So clearly, in two videos, I can't cover everything from feminist metaphysics and epistemology, let alone feminist ethics. Okay, but one thing that does need to be made clear is this: there's not just one feminist voice. There are several. There's no such thing as the feminine perspective, there are feminine perspectives. So even the term feminism is somewhat misleading because there really is no such thing as feminism per se. There are feminisms, but there isn't like one feminism to rule them all, if you will. Now, and there's a really important reason for that. There are different ways of being a woman. And if there's anything that the history of feminist social criticism and philosophy has told us, it's that it's largely inappropriate to say that there's some sort of objective standard or norm of what it means to be a woman that all women normatively are expected to live up to. So, um, what feminists have emphasized historically is that women should be free to uh, make determinations about what it means to be a woman on their own terms. So, women should be afforded the freedom to live out their womanhood in their own unique way and sort of manifest femininity or whatever in their own unique way. So you can't really compare two women who are living their lives differently and are sort of living out their womanhood or becoming a woman differently and say, aha, well, one of them is more of a woman than the other because, you know, this woman has these kinds of characteristics or engages in these kinds of behaviors or has these kinds of values. Well, and this woman has, this set of values and places priority on these kinds of things. That's not appropriate. Okay. Now, but what, generally speaking, feminist philosophers and social critics have been in agreement on is that a goal of feminism is the liberation of women in society. But to talk about the liberation of women obviously presupposes a set of problems or conditions that women need to be liberated from, right? And then as well, depending on how you understand the conditions and problems that women need to be liberated from, you're going to have different sort of modes or procedures or principles which are then going to be used to seek that goal of liberation in society. Not only that, but what liberation looks like and when we know that it's actually been accomplished in society will be different. So again, this is an area where feminist philosophers and social critics of all kind will disagree with each other. They'll disagree on what exactly the set of problems or conditions are exactly, and what might be the best ways of moving forward for doing away with those problems. Okay, so here's one example. If you take let's say not a, but if you take the characteristic goal of feminism to be making women the social, political, and economic equals of men, then you are understanding the liberation of women primarily in terms of kind of securing equal rights for women in society. Okay, now, and certainly in what is typically referred to as first wave feminism, that was largely the concern, concern for women's suffrage, um, uh, securing for women the right to hold public office, the right to divorce, the right to own land, all the kinds of privileges that men enjoy in society, right? And that certainly is true. Now, um, that sounds great, but one feminist, Hilda Lindemann, says, well, it's actually quite problematic to make making women the social, political, and economic equals of men like the main concern of women's liberation in society. And here's why. Um, if you make the goal of feminism, kind of the characteristic goal of feminism, making women the social, political, and economic equals of men, you are actually using men as the standard that women should be aiming for, right? So here, again, women aren't kind of defining their own understanding of womanhood and what it means to be a successful woman in society on their own terms. They actually need to look to men for their understanding of what well-being consists of. So women might be independent in how they pursue well-being, but women nevertheless need to look to men for their understanding of what well-being consists of. So Hilda Lindemann says that this is actually enforcing a type of women's dependence upon men. And it seems kind of odd to say that what it means to be a successful woman in society is to be more like a man. So if the goal of feminism is to make women more like men, then the goal of feminism is kind of to eliminate women, and that's really odd. So Hilda Lindemann would say, no, to the extent that social and economic and political equality on the one hand and maybe even equity on the other are important, um, we can't reduce the goal of feminism in terms of the liberation of women. We can't reduce it to that. That's problematic because reducing it actually enforces another kind of women's dependence upon men. So Lindemann thinks that characteristic goals of feminism involve equal consideration of feminine perspectives and doing something about the imbalance of social and political power in society. Okay, and when we're talking about social power, and political power, I'll say more about this momentarily. But what we do with social categories is we actually encapsulate a set of values in society through the way that society is structured and through the way that society is organized. So this is why conversations of gender and conversations of race are so important. So clearly the color of your skin makes no difference with respect to the kind of moral consideration that you should be given by others. I mean, everybody agrees with that. However, what happens is if we make class distinctions or social distinctions in society on the basis of skin color, or we sort of stratify society or categorize society or have certain organizations or institutions in society which place certain values on the basis of skin color. That's why it's a problem. So that is how racism is created. So racism is not the idea that the color of your skin matters with respect to your moral value. It's a matter of society is organized in such a way, or there are social institutions in society on the basis of skin color, and it's by society having those institutions and organizations arranged in that kind of way. Society encapsulates a set of values which seems to send the message that the color of your skin makes a difference in the kind of consideration that you ought to be given. So even though almost everybody would agree that the color of your skin makes no difference about your value as an individual. Whether or not we as individuals believe that is an entirely different matter from whether or not there are social norms and practices and institutions and organizations which operate from the basis as if the color of your skin matters. Okay, so that's why things like racism and sexism are not primarily about individual biases or individual attitudes. Okay, so there's a difference between racial bias and racism. There's a difference between sexist bias and sexism. Okay, so let me give you an example with respect to sexism. If I were to just take a video camera and interview people about their views of women, Suppose I find a gentleman who, and I say, "Hey, do you want to do a short video interview?" And he says, "Yeah, sure." And I say, "So tell me, sir, do you like women?" And he says, "Yes, I love women. That's why I married one." And I say, "Okay, so you think your wife is a good woman?" "Yes, I do. I think my wife is a good woman." And I ask him, "Okay, well, why is your wife a good woman?" And suppose this is what he says. Suppose he says, "My wife is a good woman because she has dinner made for me. Dinner's on the table when I come home from work. She does my laundry and folds it. She takes care of the kids. She cleans the house, you know. That's what makes her a good woman." Okay, so I have no doubt in my mind that this gentleman loves his wife dearly. Absolutely. So I would not call into question the affection that this gentleman has for his wife, or the fondness that he has for his wife, or anything like that. I don't think that this gentleman has any sort of hateful attitudes about his wife or anything like that. But in characterizing being a good woman in this kind of way, is there an encapsulated set of values which are largely enforced through social institutions and upbringing and things like this? I would say absolutely. So if we organize society in such a way where the woman's place is in the home, and we teach our children that, and in the past we've had actual like formal barriers preventing women from having um, positions of power in society and the public, because we say no, the woman's place is in the home. It's because the woman's place is in the home that we're going to have these kinds of barriers which prevent women from holding public office and voting and things like that. I mean, that played a role here. um, this gentleman's answer communicates a set of values, even if this gentleman does not mean to communicate that set of values, right? So again, I don't think that this gentleman, as far as I can tell, has any hateful attitudes about his wife. But just because it's not a hateful attitude, that doesn't mean it's not a sexist attitude. So, what that answer communicates, again, whether this gentleman is aware of that or not, it communicates a certain norm or standard or a set of expectations that women are largely expected to fall into. So, the answer presupposes a certain mold or norm, and then largely anything which deviates from that norm, is less than woman, right? And that is largely historically the role that men have played in society. Men have not only gotten to define what it means to be a good woman, they've also gotten to define what it means to be a real man and things like that. So, the classical feminist Simone de Beauvoir, this is what she means when she says historically, woman has been the second sex. Historically, women have not been afforded the opportunity to define and understand what it means to be a woman in terms of their own potentialities and possibilities. Woman has always been defined in a way that complements men, in terms of the way that we organize society and we codify a set of values. Now, but why has that historically been the case? That's historically been the case because, as far as power dynamics in society, men have in Western society historically been the ones that have held on to the social power. It's men that have been responsible for organizing society, and with organizing and creating certain social institutions, those social institutions and organizations not only reflect our values, but they codify values and they enforce certain kinds of values, right? Men have been the ones that have been in charge to determine what the social values are. Men are the ones who, we've historically looked up to find our value and to determine what is actually valuable. So women are told, well, to be a good woman, you got to look this way, you got to act this way, you got to speak this way. So, and we do this from the time that women are young girls, so it's not a coincidence that kind of the quintessential girl toys are things like baby dolls and toy kitchens and Barbie dolls. Well, who designed the Barbie doll? Well, men did. And what kinds of features does Barbie have? Well, she has features that are desirable to men, right? And with giving young girls baby dolls, indirectly we're telling them, well, get ready for motherhood because that's largely where your value as a woman resides in, your ability to be a mother and a caretaker. Okay. Now, so when we organize society in a certain kind of way, the way we organize it presupposes a certain set of values, and we codify value, and we say that certain social dynamics and certain social properties have social capital, right? So, what's the social capital of the woman in our society? Well, her social capital is in her ability to be a mother and to be a caretaker, because men, we can't be mothers, right? And it's not our place to be caretakers. Why? Because we're the ones that are outside the home in the public, bringing home the bacon, as it were. Okay, so that's the short version of this. Okay, now, so in terms of the liberation of women, what feminism has been about, to the extent that it's about the liberation of women, is about the identification and criticism of oppressive, exploitative, marginalizing, and sort of dominating social institutions and social dynamics. Okay, now a lot of times words like oppression and exploitation and marginalization get thrown around a lot without sort of much understanding of what these terms actually mean. Okay, so there's a difference between being oppressed and being offended. So if something offends you, you're not a victim of oppression, right? Oppression is a matter of whether or not there are actual systemic barriers to self-fulfillment in society. Okay, so a group of individuals is oppressed when there are social institutions and organizations, social, political, and economic barriers which prevent them from living their lives to the fullest when other individuals in society are given opportunity to live their lives to the fullest. So if something that somebody says offends you, that doesn't constitute a barrier to your living your life as you see fit. Okay, so if halfway through this lecture video you're just deeply offended at something that I say, you're not oppressed. Why? You can freely shut off this lecture video at any time. You don't like what I have to say, you can turn off this lecture video right now and go to a different YouTube channel. That's not oppression. Okay. Um, if you're a white male and you feel like your white male sensibilities are being offended by society, that's not oppression. Why? Because there aren't any barriers to you holding public office. There aren't any barriers, you know, socially or economically or politically. I mean, white males have like 99% of the social and political capital in this country. So the idea that white cisgender heteronormative males are losing their rights in society, nothing could be further from the truth here. Um, white males are the most represented demographic politically and economically in the United States. So if you want to look at real oppression, look at the degree of representation, look at economic disparity, look at statistics correlating race and being underprivileged, look at test scores, look at living in certain geographical areas, living in certain tax brackets, coming from certain school districts, test score, all of that matters in these kinds of things. Okay. Now, when we're talking about marginalization, a group of individuals would be marginalized if the social dynamics and the sort of set of values which society says that they care about through their institutions and their organizations is when people are made to feel as if there's not a place here for them. So if the social values are a set of racialized and genderized values, then unless you're a member of that race or gender, you might be made to feel as if you don't quite fit here, you don't quite have a place here, or this society is not for me, it's for members of this demographic. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So what feminists are concerned with is identifying historically what those oppressive or exploitative or marginalizing or dominating institutions and power dynamics are and seeking to correct them. Okay, now, so a better term that we could use for a power dynamic is kind of a sphere of influence with respect to how certain social demographics are given value. Okay, all right, so white males have held more social influence than any other demographics have, and that still is the case today. I mean, just look at the president's cabinet, look at Congress, look at the Supreme Court, look at the the CEOs of most major Fortune 500 companies and things like that. It's basically a bunch of rich white men. All right. Okay. Now, the last thing I'll mention here is this notion of gender as a social construction. All right, and it's here that a lot of the anti-feminist literature and a lot of the literature that is critical of feminism is just completely wrong about what this means. So these are common objections. So individuals that are opposed to the notion that gender is socially constructed, a lot of times you'll hear things like, well, people who say that gender is socially constructed means that gender is all relative, that one day you can just wake up and just magically decide you're not a member of a given gender. Gender is completely separated from any sort of natural facts or biological facts and yada yada yada. But I mean, historically, that has not been the case. Okay, so I already mentioned skin color. So I mean, the color of your skin is a biological reality. But whether or not skin color has anything to do with your place in society, that would be a social construction. Okay, so the fact that at one point in time society was organized on the basis of skin color, where if you were white you could go in that bathroom, but if you were a person of color you had to go in that bathroom. So what is that? That's a social reality which is centered around a biological fact, right? Okay, so and that's largely all social constructions are. So let me give you a different example. I was giving a public lecture on gender, and I started by saying this. I was defending the claim that gender is socially constructed, and I said, now how many of you in the audience, how many of you are inclined to say um, there are no social constructions at all? Like the very notion of gender being socially constructed is just absurd. And I'd say probably half the audience did this. And I said, why did you raise your hands? Right? I said, I didn't say raise your hand if you think that there are no social constructions. All I asked was, how many of you think that there are no social constructions? Okay, when somebody asks a question and you respond by going like this, what is that? That's a way of answering the question in an affirmative sense. So how many of you? Oh, me. What are you doing? You're answering the question. Okay, well, why is it that doing that and that kind of social contexts constitutes answering a question? Because that's a social construction. So the fact that this has the input of meaning answering a question in the affirmative, well, why does this in certain social contexts mean answering the question in the affirmative instead of, hey, how you doing? It's a social construction. That's exactly what a social construction is. Now, so clearly raising your hand is a set of natural functions and biological functions, but the fact that this has a certain kind of meaning in a given set of social dynamics, it only has that meaning because of the social context. It's a social construction, right? Okay, now here's another example. So this is a map showing several of the major rivers in the United States. We've got the Mississippi River, we've got the Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Arkansas River, right? Lovely. Okay, look at the Mississippi River for a moment. So look between Illinois and Missouri and Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota, right? And Arkansas and Tennessee and Mississippi and Louisiana, right? What does the Mississippi River constitute? Doesn't it constitute the border between Illinois and Missouri? So the Mississippi River is a natural fact, right? So the fact that there's a body of water separating two land masses, that body of water was there long before there were any human societies. But what about the fact that the Mississippi River constitutes the border between Illinois and Missouri, right? That's a social fact. Prior to human beings designating it as having that legal boundary. Okay, well, where's the legal boundary between Illinois and Missouri going to be? Well, what about the river? Right? Now, the reason why a lot of times we do that is because we have a nice natural formation between two land masses, so it constitutes a clearly defined legal boundary. So the fact that the Mississippi River is a natural body of water separating two land masses, that's a natural fact. But the fact that we designate it with a legal boundary, that's a social fact. Okay? So the idea that facts about gender are completely separated from facts about biology or any natural facts, historically that has been false, and here is why. We can construct social realities and social facts around natural realities and natural facts all the time. Borders are a perfect example of that. Now, but if you look at the border between Michigan and Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, there's no natural boundary there. So there's a legal designation, the border between Michigan and Ohio, and the border between Michigan and Indiana, right? But if you drive to the border of Michigan and Indiana, there's not going to be any natural feature there which they centered the legal boundary around, in the same way that there's a natural feature, a body of water separating Illinois and Missouri. The reason why they said it that way is because, hey, it's a clearly defined boundary. Okay, so historically, how has gender played itself out? This is what Simone de Beauvoir says. Simone de Beauvoir says that historically, gender has been the social meaning of sex. Okay, so the fact that historically we have said that the value of a woman as a social being, the value of a woman as a social being resides in her ability to be a mother. Okay, the fact that biological females are capable of being mothers, that is a natural fact. That is a biological fact. But if we say that women who are also biologically female are valuable to in society, you know, their social value or their social capital resides in their ability to be mothers, what we are doing is we are creating a social boundary. We are creating a social boundary around a biological fact. So the idea that by necessity, gender as a social construction is completely separable from biological facts. No, it need not be. So, not all social facts need to be centered around biological facts or natural facts. Again, the border between Michigan and Indiana is a perfect example. But the fact that gender as a social construction is not strictly determined by biological facts, it doesn't mean that it is always completely independent of biological facts. We can create social realities and social facts around biological facts. Okay? So, but what feminists are committed to is this: that gender then will consist of roles, expectations, and behaviors that are deemed valuable by the institutions of power. So when we're, you know, the idea of the social value of a biological kind, or the social value of certain natural behaviors or dispositions towards certain kinds of behaviors, right? Okay, so women are expected to be biologically female, first of all. And to the extent that women are expected to be biologically female, they are also expected to be mothers and caretakers, right? So the value of the woman resides in her ability to function biologically in certain kinds of ways. So that is why there are still to this day social stigmas around women who are incapable of having children. Oh, well, you must feel like less of a woman. Or, you know, women who are in their middle ages and, you know, in their 30s and 40s and aren't married and don't have children and those kinds of things. Okay. All right. Now, so given that, the fact that we can create social realities around natural realities and biological realities is that, okay, fine. But the idea here is that the biological facts do not strictly determine the social facts. So if facts about gender consists of a set of norms and expectations that are typically enforced by institutions of power, you can't establish a bridge between biology and the social facts. Okay? All right. And in the next video, we'll continue this conversation and get into ethics.